The seating card did not just banish me from the family section, it proved I was merely a signature they desperately needed. My sister craved an old money aesthetic while hiding the person keeping our family afloat. I did not cry or argue. I simply grabbed my envelope and walked away. By leaving, I was not just taking back a wedding present, I was destroying their elaborate scheme to use this marriage to mask a massive financial fraud. My name is Serenity Diaz. I am 34 years old, and as I stepped onto the immaculate stone driveway of La Ventana House, I knew immediately that I did not belong in my sister's fairy tale. The estate was a sprawling monument to excess, dripping with imported white orchids and draped in yards of sheer silk that caught the late afternoon sun. It was designed to look like a multi-generational legacy, a manufactured history of old wealth. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit. It was structured, modest, and sharp. It was the armor of a woman who spent her life fixing broken ledgers and restructuring failing corporate entities, standing in stark contrast to the performative opulence bleeding from every corner of the venue. The string quartet played a modern pop song masquerading as a classical symphony. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided past holding silver trays of expensive champagne. I walked through the grand foyer, feeling the heavy weight of the dark green envelope resting inside my handbag. I had already visited the towering gift table in the reception hall, moments after arriving to place it among the mountain of elegantly wrapped boxes. That envelope contained a signed legal document that would erase a debt of nearly $680,000 that my parents owed to our family trust. It was a clean slate. It was my olive branch, my final, desperate attempt to bridge the massive chasm between me and my blood relatives. I planned to let them open it tomorrow, a quiet resolution to decades of resentment and financial strain. I made my way toward the dining terrace to find my seat for the reception. The tables were arranged in a sweeping crescent around a massive crystal chandelier suspended from a towering, ancient oak tree. The center tables, draped in heavy velvet and adorned with gold-rimmed chargers, were clearly reserved for the family and the bridal party. I scanned the beautifully calligraphed seating chart near the entrance. My eyes traced the names of the Talbot family, the wealthy groom's side, and the Diaz family. My own blood. My name was absent from the inner circle. I kept scanning, moving my gaze outward, past the extended family, past the college friends, past the business associates. I finally found the elegant little card bearing my name. Serenity Diaz, Table 42. I walked the length of the terrace, the tables growing smaller and the floral centerpieces less elaborate the further I went. Table 42 was not just at the back. It was tucked behind a massive stone pillar, pressed firmly against the narrow, unadorned corridor used by the catering staff. To my left was the vendor check-in station, where a man with a headset was furiously ticking names off a clipboard and whispering into a microphone. To my right, the swinging doors of the kitchen breathed hot air and the harsh clatter of silverware every few seconds. Carts loaded with dirty plates and extra water glasses were already being staged a few feet from my assigned chair. They had quite literally seated me with the hired help and the service equipment. I stood there, staring at the delicate gold lettering of my name on the card, the reality of my placement washing over me in a wave of freezing clarity. It is a bit out of the way, is it not? I turned to see one of the bridesmaids, a woman whose name I vaguely recalled as Piper, holding a glass of pale rose. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering dismissively on my charcoal suit. "Noel said you prefer to be out of the spotlight," Piper continued, her tone dripping with a thin layer of venom disguised as polite conversation. "She mentioned you are always working anyway. You definitely look more like someone processing paperwork than a relative of the bride. No offense, of course." "None taken," I replied, my voice dangerously level. I did not give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I merely turned my attention back to the broader room, assessing the battlefield. Across the terrace, the pre-dinner cocktail hour was in full swing. I spotted my parents, Hector and Dana Diaz. They were holding court near the edge of the manicured lawn, practically vibrating with a desperate, nervous energy. My mother wore an overly embellished gown that tried too hard to whisper old money, but ended up screaming newly acquired credit debt. She was laughing far too loudly at a joke made by Owen Talbot, the groom. Owen stood tall, looking effortlessly comfortable in his bespoke tuxedo, the very picture of inherited ease and genuine wealth. Beside him stood his aunt, Claire, casting an analytical, razor-sharp eye over the extravagant floral arrangements and the excessive champagne towers. My parents were playing their roles perfectly, acting the part of the established, wealthy estate owners welcoming a high society son-in-law into their elite fold. They nodded, they smiled, they gestured grandly toward the sprawling grounds as if they owned the very earth beneath their feet. It was a flawless performance, built entirely on a foundation of sand, unpaid loans, and lies. Then, the crowd parted, and my sister made her grand entrance. Noel Diaz was a vision in custom couture, a cloud of tulle and hand-sewn pearls that must have cost more than most people earned in 2 years. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who lived her entire life for the camera lens. She spotted me standing by the catering corridor and excused herself from her circle of wealthy admirers, gliding over with a sweet, radiant smile plastered perfectly on her face. As she stepped into the shadows of the stone pillar, away from the gaze of the Talbot family, the warmth in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating appraisal. "You made it," Noel said, her voice dropping to a hushed, sharp whisper. She barely glanced at my face, her eyes instead scanning my suit with obvious distaste. "I was worried you would wear something too corporate. It is a bit stiff, but I suppose it blends into the background well enough." "It is table 42, Noel," I said, my tone flat, refusing to let any hurt bleed into my words. "I am sitting next to a stack of extra napkins and the dirty dish carts." Her fake smile tightened, just a fraction of an inch. "Serenity, please do not make a scene. You know how you get. The center tables are for the aesthetic. We are going for a very specific, old-money European vibe for the photographer, and your whole energy is just so harsh. It does not fit the vision. Besides, Owen's family needs to be front and center to feel respected." She reached out, adjusting a stray thread on my lapel with patronizing care. "It is just for dinner. Just stay tucked away here, enjoy the free food, and whatever you do, please avoid the main family portraits by the fountain later. You just do not blend with the aesthetic we are trying to project to the Talbots. We need them to see us a certain way." She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive, heavy perfume momentarily suffocating the smell of roasting meats wafting from the kitchen doors. "Just do not ruin the framing today." "Okay," she whispered, her voice devoid of any sisterly affection. "This has to be absolutely perfect." She patted my arm, turned on her heel, and instantly resurrected her glowing, angelic smile as she walked back into the blinding light of the reception, ready to play the perfect bride for her wealthy new husband and his influential family. I stood alone in the shadows of the kitchen entrance, the noise of the clattering plates fading into a dull roar as my sister's words echoed in my mind. Do not ruin the framing. For 34 years, I had been the sensible one. I was the anchor that kept this family from floating away into total financial ruin. When Noel needed bailing out of another failed vanity business, I was the one auditing the damage. When my parents over-leveraged themselves to keep up appearances, I was the one negotiating the terms with the creditors. I had carried the weight of their irresponsibility silently, believing that blood demanded loyalty, no matter the personal cost to my own peace. I had brought that dark green envelope today because I still harbored a foolish, fragile hope that underneath the greed and the performance, we were a real family. I thought releasing them from their massive debts to the family trust would finally earn me a place of respect at their table. I thought my sacrifice would buy their love. But staring at the empty seat by the service carts, the truth crystallized with brutal, icy precision. I was never a sister to Noel. I was never a daughter to Hector and Dana. I was a utility. I was a human spreadsheet, a highly functional tool, a signature they desperately required to keep their delusions fully funded. They did not want my presence at this wedding. They only wanted my compliance. They needed my name on the bottom line of a legal document, not on a seat of honor among our relatives. The humiliation they intended to inflict did not break me. Instead, it set me completely free. The lingering guilt I felt for always being the stern, strict sister evaporated in the heat of the kitchen exhaust. I turned away from table 42. I walked past Piper, who was still smirking over her wineglass, oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred. I walked past the swinging kitchen doors and out of the dining terrace entirely. I moved with a calm, deliberate, and silent stride back into the main reception hall, heading straight for the mountain of gifts. The room was empty save for a few security guards patrolling the perimeter. The towering pile of silver and white boxes sat undisturbed under the soft lighting. I reached into the center of the grand display, my fingers easily finding the heavy dark green cardstock of my envelope. I pulled it out from beneath a box wrapped in silver ribbon. The wax seal was still perfectly intact. Inside was their absolute salvation, the finalized document that would give Noel her legacy and my parents their freedom from utter financial ruin. I slipped the envelope securely into the inside pocket of my charcoal suit, pressing it flat against my ribs. I did not seek out my parents to scream at them in front of their new in-laws. I did not pull my sister aside to ruin her perfect, meticulously curated day. I did not shed a single tear of grief for the family I realized I never truly had. I just turned my back on the glittering crystal chandeliers, the imported exotic flowers, and the carefully constructed fragile lie that was the Diaz family. I walked out the massive double oak doors of La Ventana House, the sound of the string quartet fading into the cool, silent evening air. I left the sparkling wedding behind me, completely undisturbed on the surface. But as I walked to my car parked in the overflow lot, I knew the absolute truth of what I had just done. They thought they had successfully pushed me out of the frame. They had no idea that by walking away, I was taking the entire canvas with me. The machine of their deception was still running, spinning its golden gears in the beautiful ballroom behind me, but they did not realize I had just reached in and removed the only engine keeping it alive. As a senior partner at Halcyon Ridge Advisory, my entire career is built on a single, brutal premise. I look at failing, collapsing structures and decide what can be salvaged and what must remain behind to burn. We specialize in corporate restructuring, stepping into the boardrooms of enterprises teetering on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. I dissect their ledgers, trace their bleeding assets, and force executives to look at the ugly truth of their mismanagement. It requires a clinical detachment, an ability to separate emotion from the bottom line. It is a strange irony that I am so highly compensated for fixing the fatal flaws of strangers, yet I spent my entire life blindly subsidizing the emotional and financial bankruptcy of my own flesh and blood. Growing up, the roles in our house were assigned with terrifying rigidity. I was designated as the load-bearing wall. I was the child expected to absorb the shock, handle the logistics, and require zero maintenance. My sister was the delicate artwork hung on that wall. She was the child who required constant pampering, endless validation, and a bottomless pit of resources. Every spare dollar, every ounce of parental energy was funneled directly into her orbit. If she wanted private ballet lessons, I wore hand-me-down winter coats. If she needed an expensive tutor to pass basic algebra, I taught myself calculus from library books. It was a silent, unwritten contract that I accepted because I mistakenly thought that was simply how families functioned. The only person who saw through this toxic, parasitical dynamic was our grandmother, Alma Diaz. She was a woman forged from iron and earth, having built our family wealth from a single patch of dirt through sheer willpower and relentless labor. She possessed a terrifyingly sharp mind and a zero-tolerance policy for illusions. A few years before she passed away, she conducted her own quiet audit of my parents and their lifestyle. What she found beneath the veneer of country club dinners and leased luxury cars was a staggering hemorrhage of the family assets. My parents had been systematically siphoning funds from our generational wealth to patch over my sister and her insatiable spending habits, as well as her endless string of disastrous, short-lived business ventures. There was the bespoke candle line that never made it to production, the high-end fitness app that crashed on launch day, and the boutique public relations firm that consisted entirely of her throwing expensive parties for her friends. My parents bankrolled every single failure, quietly liquidating the hard-earned capital to keep the golden child completely shielded from the concept of consequence. When my grandmother realized the depth of their financial treason, she acted with the swift, merciless precision of a seasoned general. She completely bypassed my parents and my sister in her final will. Instead of leaving them the keys to the kingdom, she established the Juniper Vale Trust. And in a move that permanently shifted the tectonic plates of our family dynamics, she appointed me as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. She handed me the absolute control of our legacy. The trust was not just a bank account, it was the living, breathing heart of our family wealth. It held the titles to the sprawling orchards that produced our signature harvests. It maintained the deed to a highly profitable row of rustic guest cottages nestled in the valley. Most importantly, it controlled the ironclad water rights for the entire region, alongside the massive, steady cash flow that had secretly been keeping my parents afloat for years. Overnight, I went from being the overlooked, convenient workhorse to the ultimate gatekeeper of their survival. I held the combinations and the final say over every single dime generated by the land. Naturally, my parents despised this arrangement. They viewed my stewardship not as a protective measure instituted by a wise matriarch, but as a hostile takeover by an ungrateful daughter. For the past 6 months, the pressure campaign leading up to this wedding had been utterly relentless. They bombarded me with daily phone calls, emotional guilt trips, and thinly veiled threats, all designed to secure one specific outcome. They needed me to sign a massive, irrevocable transfer of assets. The documents they kept pushing across my desk would effectively carve out a significant percentage of the trust and hand the revenue streams over to my sister as a lavish wedding present. Even more audaciously, the paperwork included a quiet little clause that would completely forgive the staggering debt they had racked up. Over the years, they had borrowed heavily against the future earnings, accumulating a deficit of precisely $680,000. They framed it as a necessary step for family unity. They said it was about presenting a strong, united front for the new in-laws. The tragic truth is, up until the moment I walked into that reception, I was actually prepared to sign a modified version of those documents. It was not out of weakness, and it certainly was not out of ignorance. I am a restructuring expert. I knew exactly how bad of an investment they were, but I was exhausted. I was so incredibly tired of the constant battle, the cold wars, the weaponized silence. I was still clinging to the pathetic, dying hope that this grand, performative wedding could be the catalyst for a reset. I reasoned that if I gave them this clean slate, if I absorbed the financial hit and gave my sister her dream scenario, maybe we could finally start over as a decent, functional family. I was willing to buy their affection, or at the very least, buy a ceasefire. I thought I was offering a monumental olive branch to heal a fractured foundation. What I did not know, what I could not have fathomed until I saw the intricate web of lies spinning across that manicured lawn, was the narrative they had already sold to the groom and his immensely wealthy family. My parents and my sister had not just kept my role a secret, they had completely rewritten reality. They had paraded around the country club and the engagement parties bragging that she was the heir apparent. They had convinced his family that she was on the verge of officially inheriting the entire family estate, presenting the Juniper Vale assets as her personal dowry. They were using my inheritance, the very resources I was managing to keep them from living on the street, to artificially inflate their social standing and secure a highly lucrative marriage. The moment by the kitchen doors was the final missing piece of data I needed to complete my audit of this family. Sitting me next to the service carts was not a careless oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated physical manifestation of how they viewed my utility. They needed me out of sight, entirely erased from the aesthetic of their new, elevated reality, while simultaneously demanding I fund the entire production. In that brief, agonizing realization, the illusion finally snapped. I understood that if I put my pen to those papers, if I released the $680,000 and signed away the orchards, I would not be healing our family. I would not be buying peace. I would simply be financing my own erasure. I would be willingly writing a blank check to subsidize their utter contempt for me. The cold logic of my profession finally took over the bruised heart of a daughter. You do not pour fresh capital into a toxic, fraudulent enterprise. You freeze the assets, you cut your losses, and you let the rotten structure collapse under the weight of its own lies. The gravel crunched beneath my heels as I walked toward the overflow parking lot. The crisp evening air felt entirely different now. It was no longer the backdrop of a family celebration, but the freezing reality of a crime scene. I unlocked my sedan and slipped into the driver's seat. The heavy dark green envelope rested on the passenger seat, an anchor keeping me tethered to the truth. I did not start the engine. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed the direct line for Mara Kincaid, the primary legal counsel for the trust. It was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening, but Mara answered on the second ring. She knew the wedding was tonight. She expected a brief, celebratory call confirming the transfer of the funds and the closing of the debt. She did not expect the absolute ice in my voice. I told her to immediately halt the recording of any and all transfer documents. I spoke with the cadence of a surgeon calling for a scalpel. I detailed the exact document identification numbers if she needed them, but I made my primary directive brutally simple. I instructed her that not a single page bearing my name or pertaining to the trust was to be filed tonight, tomorrow morning, or at any point in the foreseeable future. I demanded that a hard lock be placed on the entire system. Mara is a veteran attorney who rarely gets surprised, but there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The quiet hum of my car engine filled the space. When Mara finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual sharp confidence. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat, before revealing a piece of information that made the temperature in my car drop another 10 degrees. She told me that earlier that afternoon, someone from my parents' house had called her office to confirm an emergency. Late-night notary appointment. They had spoken to her paralegal, acting under the explicit assumption that my signature was an absolute certainty, a mere formality that would be wrapped up before the cake was even cut. My mind raced, cataloging the variables. A notary on standby, a frantic push for an immediate filing. It did not make sense unless they were trying to beat a deadline I knew nothing about. I kept Mara on the line, my breathing slow and measured. I reached over, opened the center console, pulled out my laptop, and connected it to my secure mobile hotspot. The screen cast a pale blue light across the dark interior of the car, highlighting the expensive leather seats and the pristine envelope sitting next to me. I logged into our private legal data portal, bypassing the two-factor authentication with practiced speed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, skipping past the standard financial summaries, the quarterly yield reports from the orchards, and the booking ledgers for the guest cottages. I dove straight into the pending document queues, the digital holding pen for items awaiting my final approval. It only took 3 minutes to find it. The file was cleverly mislabeled. Buried under a file path labeled as routine structural maintenance was a draft of a master asset leverage agreement. I opened the file and began to read the dense, convoluted legal jargon. It was an agreement that essentially used the entire operational cash flow of the trust, the very lifeblood of our family legacy, as immediate collateral for a massive, outside commercial loan. It was structured to bypass the standard waiting periods, allowing for an instant injection of capital, and there, at the bottom of the final page, glowing in the sterile digital space, was my electronic signature. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the familiar curves of my own name. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never authorized this catastrophic transaction. The signature was a flawless digital copy, perfectly lifted and transplanted from a previous, legitimate tax filing from 2 years ago. The precision of the forgery indicated premeditation. This was not a desperate, last-minute idea. This was a carefully engineered plot. I did not scream. I did not slam my fists against the steering wheel. The betrayal was too profound for a cheap emotional outburst. It bypassed anger and settled directly into a cold, terrifying clarity. They were not just begging for money or trying to fund a lavish lifestyle. They were actively stealing the estate and committing federal fraud using my identity. I spoke quietly into the phone, instructing Mara to initiate a full internal audit of every single document, email, and transaction related to the trust over the past 6 months. I told her to flag any file that carried my electronic signature for immediate forensic review. Mara agreed instantly. The gravity of the situation completely understood. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, leaving me in the shadows once again. While I sat in the cold, silent isolation of my car, unearthing the digital evidence of their crime, the glittering illusion inside the venue was still spinning at full speed. I knew my sister entirely too well. I knew exactly how she operated when she thought she had successfully manipulated the board. I would later have it confirmed by mutual acquaintances that as the reception moved into its second hour, she was standing near the towering, imported floral archway, holding her phone high in the air. She was actively live-streaming to hundreds of thousands of strangers, her face flushed with expensive champagne and unearned victory. She smiled flawlessly into the camera, whispering conspiratorially to her devoted followers that everything would officially be in her name by next week. She was already promising grand, exclusive video tours of the estate she believed she had just stolen, monetizing a legacy that did not belong to her. But the machinery of their deception was already starting to choke on its own gears. Near the back of the reception hall, away from the dancing and the cameras, the veneer was cracking. A representative from the elite private security firm, hired to guard the borrowed, museum-grade bridal jewelry and oversee the extravagant honeymoon departure logistics, had approached my father near the ice sculpture. The vendor spoke in low, urgent, and unyielding tones, asking for the finalized proof of property insurance. That specific insurance policy, which carried a premium in the tens of thousands, was supposed to be fully underwritten by the newly expanded assets of the trust. It relied entirely on the assets they thought I was happily signing over to them at table 42. My parents tried to brush the vendor away. My mother waved her manicured hand, offering a tight, breathless laugh, insisting that the paperwork was simply delayed by the holiday weekend and that everything was perfectly guaranteed. My father stepped in, his voice slightly raised, trying to use his practiced authority to intimidate the man into silence and force him to leave the reception area. But the vendor did not retreat. The financial stakes were too high to accept empty promises and arrogant dismissals. From across the expansive room, Owen stood perfectly still with a glass of scotch in his hand. He was not looking at his beautiful new bride spinning on the custom marble dance floor. He was watching my parents with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator sensing weakness. He possessed the quiet, observant intelligence of a man who managed incredibly complex aviation logistics for a living. He understood systems, and he understood when a system was failing. He noticed the rigid, defensive posture of my father. He saw the frantic, terrified look flashing in my mother's eyes behind her thick layers of makeup. He watched the highly paid wedding planner nervously approach the argument, her clipboard pressed tightly to her chest like a shield. Whispering frantically to the venue's senior finance director, Owen saw the exchanged glances. He saw the panic seeping through the cracks of the perfect old money aesthetic. He was beginning to realize that the wealthy, established family he had just married into was sweating like desperate gamblers who could not cover their massive debts. Sitting in my car, looking at the glowing dashboard, I finally understood the full scope of the battlefield. The humiliation they subjected me to with that seating arrangement was not the main event. It was a distraction. It was a calculated psychological tactic meant to break me down, make me feel small, and rush me into handing over the envelope so they could complete the transaction without me looking too closely at the details. The story had entirely shifted. This was never about a family seeking forgiveness or a sister wanting my blessing for her new life. It was a massive, multi-layered financial fraud, and my signature was the final, desperate piece they needed to pull it off. They did not want my love. They needed my legal compliance to avoid prison. I put the car in gear. The headlights illuminated the dark road leading away from the sprawling estate. The wedding was still glowing brightly in my rearview mirror. A beautiful, rapidly sinking ship. They thought they were waiting for me to come crawling back with the papers to beg for a scrap of their attention. They had no idea I was driving away with the only lifeboat. The grand party did not collapse all at once. Illusions of that magnitude rarely shatter instantly. Instead, they suffer a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 tiny cuts. Back at the sprawling venue, the 10-piece jazz orchestra swung smoothly into another classic standard, the brass section echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. The hired videographers continued to circle the custom marble dance floor like devoted satellites, bathing the wealthy guests in soft, golden light to capture every manufactured moment. To the untrained, intoxicated eye, La Ventana House remained the absolute epicenter of a flawless, high-society triumph. But sitting miles away in the quiet, sterile sanctuary of my home office, I did not need to be in the room to witness the destruction. I watched the entire facade bleed out through the glowing financial dashboard on my monitor and the frantic, angry text messages lighting up my mobile phone. The first casualty of my departure was the sky. At exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, the guests were supposed to be ushered out onto the expansive stone terrace for a bespoke, highly choreographed pyrotechnic display over the private lake. It was a massive surprise my sister had been teasing on her social media for months, a grand finale meant to cement her status among her new peers. But on my screen, a glaring red notification appeared from the pyrotechnic vendor. The final escrow deposit, a staggering sum meant to be cleared by the trust's emergency credit line just before launch, slammed against the hard lock I had initiated. The pyrotechnic director, a businessman who dealt strictly in cleared funds and not empty promises, simply powered down his launch panels and ordered his crew to pack up the trucks. The guests stood out on the chilly terrace holding their breath, looking up at a sky that remained stubbornly dark. My parents scrambled to the microphones, nervously blaming local noise ordinances and sudden, unforeseen permit issues. They laughed it off with tightly clenched jaws, but the first seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of the audience. The second crack appeared right after the traditional first dance, and it was far more personal. Noel had been wearing a breathtaking vintage diamond collar borrowed from a highly exclusive private collector in Europe. It was the centerpiece of her bridal aesthetic, an artifact valued in the millions. Securing it required a temporary insurance rider backed by a solid, verifiable asset portfolio. The moment the underwriter's automated system pinged the Juniper Vale Trust and found the assets completely frozen and under internal audit, the liability coverage evaporated instantly. I could perfectly picture the discreet, terrifying panic that followed. A handler in a sharp black suit, representing the collector, materialized at the edge of the dance floor the very second the music stopped. He did not cause a screaming scene, but he was an immovable force of protocol, with whispered apologies and an iron grip on his contractual rights. He escorted my sister to a private side room and calmly unclasped the priceless necklace. When Noelle returned to the grand reception hall, she tried to smile, but the glaring, pale emptiness around her neck was far louder than any announcement the band could make. By 11:30, the logistical failures began to compound exponentially. The exclusive after-party was scheduled at a high-end downtown lounge, and a fleet of pristine, vintage luxury sedans had been booked to transport the bridal party and the most important guests. The logistics coordinator for the transport company sent an automated email that copied my administrative address. The dispatch was officially canceled. The wire transfer for the remaining balance was permanently stuck in a status reading pending trustee approval. Without my digital authorization, the cars remained locked in their garages across town. The bridal party, accustomed to seamless luxury, was left stranded on the gravel driveway in the freezing night air. Shivering in their thin silk gowns, eventually forced to wait for standard rideshare vehicles like absolute commoners. Panic always requires a scapegoat, and my family possessed decades of practiced skill in using me as theirs. Through the barrage of messages from confused cousins, I saw exactly how my sister was attempting to control the narrative. Noel had retreated to the bridal suite, holding court among her bridesmaids, weeping perfectly constructed tears. She claimed that I had stormed out of the venue in a sudden, violent fit of bitter jealousy. She spun a tragic, theatrical tale of a spinster sister who simply could not handle seeing her younger sibling find true love, limitless wealth, and genuine happiness. She told everyone I was deliberately sabotaging her big day out of pure spite, weaponizing my absence to paint herself as the ultimate victim. My parents eagerly reinforced the barricades of this pathetic lie. When wealthy guests or confused vendors inquired about the missing fireworks or the sudden logistical hiccups, my mother would offer a deeply practiced, sorrowful sigh. She murmured to anyone who would listen that I was tragically extreme when I was not the center of attention. My father shook his head over his glass of expensive scotch, playing the role of the exhausted, stoic patriarch dealing with a mentally unstable, vindictive daughter. They wove a tapestry of my supposed fragility, using character assassination to buy themselves enough time to figure out why the financial pipelines had suddenly run bone dry. However, they severely underestimated the man my sister had just married. Owen Talbot was not a foolish trust fund playboy who spent his days lounging on golf courses and ignoring balance sheets. He was the chief operating officer of a highly successful private aviation fleet. His entire professional career was built on identifying systemic failures, mitigating risk, and ensuring complex, multi-million-dollar logistics ran flawlessly under extreme pressure. He knew the distinct difference between a jealous sibling throwing a dramatic tantrum and a catastrophic infrastructure collapse. A missing sister did not automatically ground a fleet of hired luxury cars. A jealous sibling did not cause an elite jewelry handler to repossess a diamond collar in the middle of a wedding reception. Owen watched the chaos unfold, quietly connecting the dots in his sharp mind. Every single glitch, every halted service, every panicked whisper from the venue coordinators all pointed back to one localized, systemic failure. It was a massive, sudden lack of liquid capital. He realized the glitches were not emotional. They were entirely transactional. The final, undeniable fracture of the evening came courtesy of Owen's aunt. Claire Talbot was a senior partner at a cutthroat corporate law firm in Manhattan, specializing in high-stakes mergers and acquisitions. She possessed an unparalleled, almost predatory ability to smell financial desperation from across a crowded room. While the rest of the guests were distracted by the cutting of the cake, Claire cornered my parents near the empty dessert station. She did not ask a single question about me or my supposed jealousy. She asked about the land. With casual, lethal precision, she inquired about the zoning permits for the upcoming resort expansion Noel had been boasting about all evening. She asked about the specific deed structures of the Juniper Vale estates and how the water rights were allocated. The response she received was a masterclass in contradictory panic. My father, sweating through his tuxedo shirt but trying to project absolute authority, claimed the estate was held in a simple, revocable family trust that he personally oversaw and controlled. My mother, completely crumbling under Claire's intense, unblinking gaze, nervously stuttered that the land was actually entirely in Noel's name as an early, tax-free inheritance. Two completely different, legally incompatible structures offered within 30 seconds of each other. Claire merely smiled a thin, terrifying smile, her sharp eyes taking in the profound terror radiating from my parents. She did not push the interrogation any further. She did not need to. The discrepancy was a glaring, enormous red flag planted right in the middle of the dance floor. The wedding night, which had begun as an immaculate, bulletproof illusion of old money and deep roots, was slowly bleeding out before their eyes. The music kept playing, and the expensive alcohol kept pouring. But the foundation had entirely liquefied. The cracks were no longer microscopic. They were running up the walls, tearing through the sheer silk drapery, and exposing the hollow, rotting core of the Diaz family. And as midnight approached, a suffocating, unspoken truth hung heavy over the remaining guests. Something massive was collapsing, and no one dared to name it, but they were all just standing in the beautiful wreckage, waiting for the roof to finally cave in. I bypassed my apartment entirely. The steering wheel felt like a block of ice under my palms as I navigated the empty midnight highways toward the downtown financial district. My corporate security badge beeped loudly in the cavernous, deserted lobby of the Halcyon Ridge Advisory Building. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when the private elevator doors slid open on the 42nd floor. The offices were completely dark, save for the motion sensor lights that clicked on as I walked down the long hallway. Mara was already waiting for me inside my glass-walled conference room. Beside her sat Ruth Bell. Ruth was a senior forensic document examiner, a quiet, meticulously sharp woman who spent her entire professional life hunting for lies hidden inside ink strokes and digital pixels. I dropped my car keys on the long mahogany table, opened my laptop, and booted up the main projection screen on the far wall. We did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I gave Ruth secure, unrestricted access to the locked data room of the trust. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the expansive room were the sharp clicks of a computer mouse and the low, steady hum of the building ventilation system. I poured 3 cups of black coffee, watching the city skyline glitter outside the window, while my family's secrets were laid bare on the table. Ruth isolated the master asset leverage agreement I had discovered in the parking lot. She pulled up a verified, legitimate digital signature of mine from a standard tax return filed 3 years ago and placed it side by side with the authorization on the new loan document. She magnified the image on the projector by 400%. The forgery was incredibly sophisticated, but to a trained eye, it was still undeniably a forgery. Ruth pointed her pen at the projection, highlighting the microscopic pixel degradation around the edges of the digital ink. She explained exactly how the timestamps within the file metadata had been clumsily scrubbed and replaced using a commercial PDF editor. 10 minutes later, she found a second fraudulent document buried in a mislabeled subfolder. It was a broad, sweeping power of attorney agreement. This specific document granted my father temporary, unilateral authorization to pledge the quarterly cash flow of the trust as hard collateral. My digital signature was perfectly stamped on the bottom line. Both signatures were absolute fakes, with the criminal forgery officially confirmed. I turned my sharpest attention to the money trail. I am a senior restructuring partner. Tracking hidden capital through complex corporate mazes is what I do best. I pulled up the external vendor accounts and cross-referenced them with the routing numbers tied to the fake collateral agreements. The lender was not a traditional, regulated banking institution. The funds had been advanced by Blue Lark Capital. They were a private equity firm notorious within my industry for issuing aggressive, predatory hard money loans. They catered to desperate clients who could not pass standard underwriting, charging exorbitant interest rates and demanding massive balloon payments. My parents had bypassed every legitimate financial avenue and gone straight to the corporate loan sharks. My parents had explicitly claimed to me that their staggering $680,000 deficit was strictly for critical estate maintenance. They swore they needed the funds to replace the aging irrigation systems in the orchards and repair the roofs of the guest cottages. The digital ledger projected on the wall told a vastly different, sickening story. I tracked the disbursements from Blue Lark Capital dollar by dollar. The money flowed like water through a cracked sieve, pouring directly into a sprawling network of shell accounts and vanity projects. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled straight into my sister's failing lifestyle boutique to cover years of unpaid commercial rent and vendor lawsuits. I found recurring monthly wires paying for fraudulent social media engagement services to artificially inflate her follower count online. There were exorbitant invoices for leasing imported luxury vehicles on 12-month contracts. Finally, I found a massive trail of non-refundable deposits scattered across dozens of high-end wedding vendors. They had literally mortgaged my grandmother's legacy to buy a fleeting, hollow aesthetic for social media. The sheer audacity of the theft was staggering, but the true scope of their master plan did not fully reveal itself until Mara opened a file labeled Post-Nuptial Strategic Planning. It was a draft for a new corporate structure meant to be implemented exactly 30 days after the wedding ceremony. Hidden deep within the dense boilerplate language, was a newly invented consulting clause. This clause granted my sister exclusive development rights over a proposed multi-million-dollar luxury expansion of the Juniper Vale Resort. It guaranteed her an outrageous annual management fee for doing absolutely no actual work. But more importantly, it required the newly formed marital entity, meaning my sister and her wealthy new husband, to act as the primary financial guarantors for all future construction loans. The air in the conference room went completely still as the ultimate realization hit me. Owen Talbot was the real Mark. My family did not just want to throw a beautiful, expensive party to show off to their country club friends. They knew the predatory debt from Blue Lark Capital was coming due in a matter of months, and they had absolutely zero liquid cash to pay it back. They needed a massive structural bailout. They were using this marriage as a pristine, socially acceptable bridge to drag Owen and his flawless credit profile right into their financial sinkhole. Once he was legally bound to my sister, they planned to leverage his corporate backing and his family wealth to refinance the toxic debt under the guise of expanding the family estate. To them, Owen was not a son-in-law. He was a walking, talking line of credit wrapped in a custom tuxedo. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the glowing data projected on the glass wall. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. If I had stayed at that wedding reception, if I had handed over that dark green envelope and blindly signed the final reconciliation paperwork just to buy a scrap of my family's conditional love, I would have sealed my own total destruction. My signature on those physical documents would have retroactively legitimized the fraudulent Blue Lark loans. I would have willingly signed away the controlling interest of the trust to a network of liars. When the inevitable federal financial audits occurred, the digital trail would point directly to me as the consenting, fully aware trustee. I would have been legally liable for federal wire fraud and bank fraud. I would have lost my professional licenses, my career, and potentially my freedom. Walking out of La Ventana House was no longer just a dramatic personal exit caused by a hurtful seating arrangement by the kitchen doors. My departure had acted as an accidental, life-saving emergency brake. By leaving the venue and immediately freezing the trust, I had halted the exact mechanism required to finalize the transfer of the stolen funds. The gears of their elaborate trap had slammed to a violent halt simply because their primary target refused to play her assigned, submissive role. The lingering, painful sting of being treated like a stranger by my own blood completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a ruthless, absolute clarity. This was no longer a petty domestic dispute over wedding aesthetics. I was no longer an older sister trying to teach a spoiled sibling a harsh lesson in humility. I was a fiduciary guardian standing directly between a syndicate of desperate criminals and the empire my grandmother had bled to build from the ground up. My parents and my sister had declared a quiet, brutal war on my life, my reputation, and my future. They fully intended to leave me financially and legally ruined while they toasted to their newly stolen wealth. I looked across the table at Mara and Ruth, the harsh fluorescent lights reflected in their eyes, mirroring the same grim understanding I felt. We had the digital evidence. We had the undeniable financial timeline. We had the proof of forgery. My goal was no longer about seeking an apology or fixing a broken family dynamic. It was about protecting the legacy I was sworn to guard. It was time to tear their carefully curated, fraudulent world down to the absolute studs. The clock on the conference room wall indicated it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Mara. Ruth and I were still sorting through the digital wreckage when my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the mahogany table. The caller identification displayed a number I did not immediately recognize, but the area code belonged to the affluent district where the Talbot family resided. I held up a hand to silence the room and accepted the call. "This is Serenity. It is Owen." His voice was barely a whisper, carried over the line alongside the faint sound of high-altitude wind. He was calling from the outdoor balcony of the bridal suite at the luxury hotel downtown. The man who had been the picture of effortless ease just a few hours ago now sounded tightly coiled, like a heavy spring ready to snap. He was angry, undeniably confused, but beneath the tension, His tone remained rigorously analytical. He was a chief operating officer running diagnostics on a sudden, catastrophic failure. "I am listening," I replied softly, stepping away from the projection screen and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark city. Owen took a slow, deep breath. He explained that after the disastrous end to the reception, the bridal party had retreated to the hotel. My father, thoroughly exhausted and severely intoxicated, had carelessly left his leather briefcase unlatched on a glass coffee table in the main living area of the suite. Owen, searching for a misplaced room key, had accidentally nudged the flap open. Sitting right on top of the pile was a legal folder containing a preliminary title commitment for the estate. His eyes had immediately caught a single bolded line printed across the bottom of the first page. It explicitly stated that the entire validity of the deed transfer was strictly pending trustee approval by Serenity Diaz. "I asked Noel about it," Owen continued, the frustration bleeding through his controlled cadence. "I just wanted a simple clarification. Instead, the room exploded." He described a scene of absolute, calculated hysteria. The moment the document was brought into the light, my sister had launched into a theatrical meltdown. She wept uncontrollably, collapsing onto the sofa in her expensive dressing gown. She weaponized her tears, aggressively accusing me of harboring deep-seated psychological issues. She painted a frantic picture of an older sister so consumed by bitter envy and clinical instability that I had dedicated my entire existence to sabotaging her moments of happiness. She claimed I was holding the family estate hostage out of pure, unadulterated spite, but Owen was not alone in his skepticism. His Aunt Claire had accompanied them to the suite to secure the remaining wedding gifts. Claire Talbot did not suffer fools, and she certainly did not base her corporate risk assessments on emotional outbursts. While my sister was busy wailing about my supposed cruelty, Claire had quietly stepped into the hallway, accessed the county clerk public property database on her mobile device, and pulled the tax records. She returned minutes later and completely dismantled the illusion. She informed Owen, right in front of my sobbing sister and my horrified parents, that the grand narrative of Noel inheriting the family land was a complete fabrication. The public records clearly showed that every square inch of the property was legally bound within the Juniper Vale Trust. "She owns absolutely nothing," Owen said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with the weight of the realization. "And now I need you to tell me exactly what the hell I just married into." This was the critical juncture. The natural human instinct would be to unleash decades of pent-up resentment, to match my sister's chaotic energy with my own furious monologue, and to drag her character through the mud. I could have called her a parasite, a liar, and a thief, but I am a restructuring partner. I know that when a man is drowning in a sea of emotional manipulation, throwing more emotion at him only pulls him under faster. The only life preserver you can offer is cold, hard, verifiable data. "I am not going to insult my sister. Owen, I am not going to tell you a story," I said, my voice maintaining a flat, even pitch. "I am going to send you an email. I need you to open it on a secure device." He provided his direct corporate email address without a second of hesitation. I walked back to the conference table, nodded to Mara, and began compiling a tight, highly encrypted digital dossier. I did not include any personal anecdotes. I attached the official legal extract of the Juniper Vale Trust, proving my sole authority. I attached the comprehensive debt history of my parents, highlighting the staggering $680,000 deficit they had hidden from the world. Finally, I attached the forensic analysis Ruth had just completed, clearly showing the exact timestamps and metadata of the forged signature they had attempted to use to push a massive, high-interest corporate loan across the finish line just hours before the ceremony. I hit send. "Check your inbox." I listened to the silence on the line as Owen opened the files. I could hear the faint click of a laptop trackpad. Minute after minute ticked by. The contrast between his current reality and the one he had been sold was colliding in real time. Downstairs in his hotel suite, my sister was likely still weaponizing her tears, relying on chaos and noise to blind him. Up on the balcony, staring at the screen, He was experiencing the exact opposite. I was giving him silence, timelines, authenticated documents, and undeniable financial facts. When he finally spoke again, the anger was entirely gone. It was replaced by a hollow, terrifying clarity. "The hospitality project," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to me. "Excuse me?" Owen exhaled a long, ragged breath. He confessed that for the past 3 months, Noel had been relentlessly pressuring him regarding their post-marital finances. She had demanded they immediately merge all their investment portfolios into a single joint account. She had pushed him to sign off on a massive, shared credit limit. But the most aggressive push had been for a new business venture. She had repeatedly asked him to act as the primary financial guarantor for a vague, high-end hospitality lifestyle brand she wanted to launch exactly 1 month after they returned from their honeymoon. "She told me it was a formality," Owen said, the disgust practically vibrating through the phone speaker. "She said it was just to satisfy the commercial lease requirements, and that her family estate would provide the actual collateral once the deed transferred." "There is no deed transfer, Owen," I replied quietly. "And there is no collateral left. They are heavily leveraged with a predatory private equity firm. That hospitality project was not a business venture. It was a refinancing vehicle. They needed your immaculate credit profile to catch them before the balloon payments destroy them." A heavy, profound silence settled between us. It was the sound of a man watching the foundation of his new life crumble into dust. This late-night phone call was the absolute turning point. For the first time since he met her, the man my sister had deliberately targeted and intended to use as her personal, unlimited financial life raft was finally able to see the entire architecture of the trap. He saw the bait, he saw the tripwire, and most importantly, he realized the cage doors had just slammed shut behind him. "Thank you, Serenity," he said softly. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I am going to make some very quiet phone calls of my own," Owen replied, his voice hardening into a blade of pure steel. "Have your legal team ready for tomorrow. This is far from over." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, looking back at the projection screen illuminating the dark conference room. The Diaz family had spent my entire life assuming they were the smartest people in the room, constantly underestimating the quiet girl in the corner. Tonight, they had finally underestimated the wrong man. The machine they built to save themselves was rapidly reversing its gears, and it was about to tear them apart. The sun was barely above the horizon when my phone vibrated against the nightstand. It was just past 7 o'clock in the morning. My screen was lit with a barrage of text messages from my parents. The tone of their messages was a jarring pivot from the panicked hostility of the previous night. Now, they were drowning in fabricated warmth. They begged for a private family talk at the old garden house situated deep within the Juniper Vale orchards. They promised a quiet, healing brunch to clear the air. My mother even threw in the ultimate emotional bribe, promising to finally give me grandmother Alma's vintage emerald ring, a keepsake I had been denied for years. They framed it as a beautiful morning of reconciliation. I stared at the glowing text, feeling absolutely nothing but cold. Clinical anticipation. I knew exactly what this invitation truly represented. It was not a peace treaty. It was a perfectly laid trap. The ruthless executives at Blue Lark Capital did not care about wedding hangovers or family drama. Their predatory loans operated on strict, unforgiving deadlines, and the clock was rapidly ticking toward a massive default. My parents needed my physical signature on those forged documents before the lenders realized the collateral was completely frozen. They were hoping they could isolate me, drown me in guilt, dangle my grandmother's ring, and force my hand before the banks opened on Monday. What they did not anticipate was the mutiny already brewing within their own carefully curated ranks. While my parents were setting their snare at the orchard, the bridal party was completely imploding at the luxury hotel downtown. My phone buzzed again, this time with a direct message from an unknown number that quickly identified itself as Piper Sloan. She was the same bridesmaid who had mocked my charcoal suit by the catering carts just hours earlier. But her arrogance had entirely evaporated, replaced by a vicious, burning rage. Piper informed me that the extravagant thank you gifts Noel had presented to her bridal party the night before were completely fraudulent. The designer boxes, which were supposed to contain expensive custom jewelry, held nothing but cheap, hollow display pieces. Furthermore, the thousands of dollars Noel had promised to reimburse each girl for their mandatory, custom-tailored dresses had never materialized in their bank accounts. The wire transfers were completely non-existent. Piper was furious, and she was armed. She sent me an audio file, a saved voice note my sister had carelessly recorded weeks ago during a drunken fitting session. I tapped play, holding the speaker close to my ear. I heard my sister's unmistakable laugh echoing over the track, followed by a sickeningly cruel sentence. Noel explicitly referred to her future husband as a walking refinancing package in a custom tuxedo. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of her predatory intentions, captured in her own mocking voice. Piper told me she was heading to the brunch, ready to tear the entire facade to the ground if she did not get her money. I told her to bring her phone and keep it fully charged. 10 minutes later, I received a brief, encrypted email from Owen. It contained exactly 3 sentences. He and his Aunt Claire were already dressed and heading to the estate. They were not going to say a single word about the financial disclosures I had provided them the night before. They were walking directly into the lion's den, fully intending to play the roles of the blissful, ignorant new family members. My sister believed she was going to use this brunch to reframe the narrative in front of her wealthy new in-laws. She planned to cry, play the fragile victim, and officially brand me as the unstable villain of the family. She had no idea that her target audience had already read the script and knew exactly how the movie was going to end. I showered, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and tailored trousers, and drove out to the Juniper Vale property. The garden house was a stunning structure of glass and reclaimed wood, nestled beautifully among rows of ancient apple trees. It was designed to look like a serene, rustic sanctuary, the perfect backdrop for a wealthy family morning after photo shoot. The morning mist was still clinging to the branches, creating a suffocating, damp atmosphere. I did not walk through those heavy oak doors alone. My parents had anticipated a solitary, emotionally vulnerable daughter arriving to grovel for a place back at the family table. Instead, the gravel crunched heavily as my black sedan pulled up, followed immediately by a dark corporate SUV. I stepped out, buttoning my blazer. Mara Kincaid stepped out of the second vehicle, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Beside her was Lila Cross, the senior forensic accountant who managed the daily ledgers for the trust. Lila was a woman who spoke almost entirely in spreadsheets and possessed a lethal memory for hidden expenditures. I carried a large, thick envelope made of heavy manila paper. It was tightly sealed with red tamper-evident tape. It contained every piece of the puzzle: the forged master asset leverage agreements, the detailed routing numbers from Blue Lark Capital, the shell company registrations, and the exact timestamps of their failed late-night notary appointment. We walked up the stone pathway in perfect unison. The soft murmur of voices drifting from the open windows of the garden house suddenly fell dead silent as our shadows crossed the threshold. I stepped into the sunlit dining room. The table was meticulously set with fine china, crystal juice glasses, and massive floral centerpieces left over from the wedding. My mother was standing near the head of the table, her hands frozen mid-air while holding a silver coffee pot. My father was seated to her right, his face instantly draining of all color. Noel was positioned perfectly across from Owen and Claire, wearing a flowing white linen dress, her eyes already brimming with carefully practiced tears. Piper sat at the far end of the table, her arms tightly crossed, her phone resting face up next to her plate like a loaded weapon. The air in the room was instantly paralyzed. This was no longer a gentle, healing family meal. The aroma of roasted coffee and fresh pastries was completely overpowered by the sharp metallic scent of impending doom. Every single person in that beautiful, sun-drenched room was playing a highly specific role, fully aware that they were standing on top of a massive powder keg. My parents were acting like benevolent peacekeepers while desperately trying to hide their terror. My sister was acting like a wounded bird while plotting my total character assassination. Owen was acting like a supportive husband while secretly holding the financial evidence of his own attempted murder. And I was standing at the head of the table, acting like a guest, while holding the match that would burn their entire illusion to ash. We all took our places around the table, the silence stretching so tight it felt like the glass windows might shatter from the pressure. No one dared to take a breath. We were merely waiting for the first person to slip, the first lie to be spoken aloud, to finally trigger the blast. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of the apple orchard, casting a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table that had been set up on the garden house terrace. It was a scene meticulously engineered for a legacy family morning after wedding spread. Crystal pitchers filled with fresh-pressed orange juice and iced water caught the morning light, and delicate porcelain plates were arranged beneath an elegant canopy of vintage Edison bulbs strung between the thick branches. Silver platters of warm pastries and fresh fruit sat untouched. The entire setup looked like a glossy photograph torn straight from the pages of a high-society lifestyle magazine. Yet, sitting in my tailored navy blazer, flanked by Mara and Lila, the air felt so incredibly thick and suffocating that drawing a single breath required a conscious, physical effort. Noel was the first to break the heavy, oppressive silence. She stood up slowly from her chair, clutching a white linen napkin in her hands. Her white summer dress caught the soft morning breeze, making her look fragile and angelic. Her performance was terrifyingly flawless. Her voice trembled perfectly as she addressed Owen and Claire, completely ignoring my presence at the opposite end of the table. She wove a tragic, elaborate narrative about a bitter older sister who simply could not bear to see anyone else shine. She claimed my sudden departure the previous night was not a reaction to being seated with the caterers, but rather the climax of decades of deep-seated jealousy. She told her new husband that since childhood, I had harbored a dark obsession with ruining her joyful moments. She painted a picture of me as a cold, corporate spinster who valued ledgers over love, claiming I had calculated my exit to deliberately humiliate our parents and destroy the most important day of her life. She dabbed at her dry eyes, casting herself as the innocent victim of my supposed psychological warfare. Right on cue, my mother shifted into the secondary phase of their coordinated trap. Dana reached into a woven basket beside her chair and placed a thick, leather-bound photo album onto the center of the table. Next to it, she gently laid out a familiar expanse of soft, intricately woven wool. It was grandmother Alma's vintage shawl, a cherished item I had requested for years, but was always denied. My mother pushed the shawl slightly toward me, offering a weak, overly sweet smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. She spoke softly, her tone dripping with manufactured maternal warmth, trying to drag me back into the subservient, people-pleasing role I had occupied since I was a teenager. She murmured about how much grandmother loved us all equally, how family must always stick together through inevitable misunderstandings, and how today was a beautiful opportunity for forgiveness and grace. It was pure emotional warfare, utilizing the ghost of the only woman who ever truly protected me as a cheap bargaining chip to lower my defenses. Then came the closing maneuver. Hector cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive linen shirt. He reached into his dark leather portfolio and produced a slim manila folder. He slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward me, the paper making a soft scraping sound against the wood. He offered a tight, forced smile and casually dismissed the contents as just a few final confirmation papers to officially close all the unfortunate logistical misunderstandings from the night before. He insisted, with a terrifyingly calm demeanor, that it was merely a standard formality to ensure Noel and Owen could start their luxurious honeymoon without any lingering administrative burdens. I did not even have to lift a single finger. Before the folder reached the center of the table, Mara Kincaid reached out and firmly planted her hand flat on top of it, stopping its forward momentum instantly. Mara did not raise her voice. She did not create a theatrical scene. She simply flipped past the cover sheet and scanned the dense legal text. She looked directly at my father with the cold, dead eyes of a veteran corporate prosecutor. She stated clearly and unequivocally to the entire table that these were not simple confirmation papers. They were cleverly backdated ratifications. She explained that if I were to put my pen to these pages today, it would legally bind me to the fraudulent asset transfers and the predatory loan agreements they had attempted to execute behind my back. It was a desperate, 11th-hour attempt to trick me into sanitizing a massive federal crime. The color instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, to spin another layer of deception, but Claire Talbot cut him off entirely. Claire leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table, her sharp, analytical gaze locking onto my parents. She did not yell, but she used the lethal, measured tone of a litigator cornering a hostile witness in a courtroom. She began asking basic, fundamental questions right in front of the assembled group, treating the brunch like a formal deposition. She asked Hector who actually held the legal title to the Valley water rights. She asked Dana to clarify exactly who possessed the authorized signature power for the estate banking accounts. She asked Noel why she had spent the last 3 months boasting to the extended Talbot family that she was inheriting the entire property when the county tax records dictated otherwise. Finally, Claire demanded to know exactly where the staggering debt of $680,000 was recorded on the official family ledgers. The synchronized panic that followed was a pathetic spectacle to behold. Hector and Dana fumbled over their words, throwing out nonsensical legal jargon and offering completely contradictory explanations. My father tried to claim the debt was a complex tax deferment strategy recommended by a former accountant, while my mother simultaneously insisted it was just a temporary cash flow issue caused by delayed vendor payments. When they realized Claire was completely immune to their desperate lies, their panic mutated into vicious, cornered anger. They abandoned the narrative of the loving, forgiving family and turned their weapons entirely on me. Dana slammed her hand on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. She screamed that I was a cold, calculating machine who lacked any basic human empathy. Hector pointed a shaking finger at my face, shouting that I was an arrogant tyrant obsessed with absolute control, completely incapable of showing unconditional love to my own blood. They tried to drown out the undeniable financial truth with a massive, deafening wave of emotional vitriol. They were so intensely focused on destroying my character and saving face in front of Owen that they completely ignored the bridesmaid sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Piper Sloan had been tapping away on her smartphone for the last 5 minutes. She had successfully paired her device with the high-end outdoor Bluetooth speakers hidden discreetly among the garden foliage. Without saying a single word, without asking for permission, Piper pressed play. The sudden sound of Noel's voice booming through the orchard speakers cut through the screaming match like a physical blade. It was the saved voice note. The pristine digital audio echoed off the glass walls of the garden house and out into the trees. Every single person at the table heard my sister laughing cruelly. They heard her exact words as she scoffed about washing away her massive debts after the wedding by utilizing Owen and his immaculate credit profile. They heard her refer to her new husband not as a romantic partner, but specifically as a walking refinancing package in a tuxedo. The atmosphere in the garden house froze solid. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the space. The birds in the canopy seemed to stop singing. The suffocating tension that had been building all morning finally snapped with devastating force. Noel let out a guttural, terrifying scream, her flawless aesthetic completely shattering in an instant. She lunged aggressively across the mahogany table, knocking over a heavy crystal pitcher of orange juice in a desperate, violent bid to snatch the phone from Piper's hands. The bright orange liquid spilled rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, soaking directly into the fraudulent, backdated documents Hector had tried to force upon me just moments prior. Owen did not move to help his frantic bride. He did not reach out to catch the falling glasses. He did not say a single word to calm her down. He just stood up slowly from his chair, his posture rigid and his face entirely blank. He looked exactly as though he had just been violently struck across the jaw. He stared down at the woman thrashing across the ruined table, watching the beautiful, fragile illusion he had fallen in love with dissolve into a desperate, grasping fraud. The final, carefully constructed mask had not just slipped, it had been smashed into 1,000 jagged pieces right in front of an audience, and there was absolutely no way to ever put it back together. Noel's scream tore through the serene morning air, shattering the last remaining illusion of the elegant garden brunch. She abandoned the ruined table and turned her absolute fury entirely on Piper. Her face, usually so perfectly composed for cameras and wealthy admirers, contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She shrieked that Piper was a jealous, spiteful traitor who was deliberately destroying her life over a few meaningless thousands of dollars. She paced back and forth across the stone terrace, her white dress catching the breeze, looking less like a bride and more like a cornered animal. Then, as if running on a deeply ingrained, toxic autopilot, she whipped her head toward me. She pointed a shaking finger across the patio and screamed that I was the architect of this entire disaster. She yelled that I had secretly manipulated her friends, hacked her phone, and orchestrated this public ambush simply because I could not stand the thought of her finally being happy. It was a desperate, chaotic attempt to throw the blame onto her favorite scapegoat, but the audience was no longer buying the performance. Claire Talbot stepped forward, cutting through Noel and her hysterical accusations with the precision of a scalpel. She did not raise her voice, but her tone commanded absolute silence. She turned her intense gaze upon my father. She demanded that he immediately produce the official notary logbook and the printed email chains he claimed represented the nearly finalized transactions. My father had brought the hired wedding notary to the brunch, a nervous young man sitting quietly at a small wrought iron side table, clutching his official stamp. Hector had planned to use the emotional pressure of the brunch to force my signature, and he wanted the notary present to make the fraudulent transfer legally binding on the spot. Mara Kincaid did not wait for my father to respond. She walked straight over to the side table and stood over the trembling young man. She demanded to see his official journal. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out the forensic report Ruth had compiled the night before. Mara placed the stark evidence right next to the open pages of the logbook. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the glaring inconsistencies. She explained, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the digital signature on the newly drafted loans did not match my historical, verified records. Furthermore, she highlighted that the timestamps on the supposed electronic confirmations had been clumsily altered to reflect future business hours. The young notary turned a sickly shade of ash gray. His eyes darted from the forensic report to my father and then to Mara. He realized in a terrifying instant that he was sitting right in the middle of a massive federal fraud conspiracy. He shoved his stamp into his canvas bag, mumbled a frantic apology about losing his license, and practically sprinted toward his car parked in the driveway. Before my parents could even attempt to recover from the notary fleeing the scene, Lila Cross made her move. The senior accountant opened her thick binder and began sliding copies of a highly detailed financial reconciliation report across the sticky juice-stained mahogany table. She made sure Owen received a copy directly in his hands. Lila spoke with the cold, detached cadence of a woman who trusted numbers far more than people. She explained exactly where the missing trust capital had actually gone. She methodically traced the diverted cash flow away from the essential estate maintenance accounts. She showed how the funds bypassed the orchard irrigation funds and the property taxes, flowing instead directly into a corporate shell entity named Velvet Prairie Media. Lila then produced the official state registration documents proving unequivocally that Noel was the sole secret proprietor of that exact company. The money meant to keep our family legacy alive had been systematically drained to fund my sister and her failing vanity projects, her fake online followers, and her leased luxury cars. Piper let out a cold, humorless laugh from the end of the table. She looked directly at Owen, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. She informed him that the entire bridal party had been forced to pay thousands of dollars out of their own pockets for their custom silk dresses, their travel accommodations, and their hair and makeup styling. She stated clearly that Noel had promised to reimburse every single dime the very second the estate was officially transferred into her name. My sister had literally financed her friendships on the promise of stolen land. The terrace went dead silent. All eyes turned to the groom. Owen finally spoke. He did not yell. He did not throw his glass against the stone wall. He looked at the woman he had married less than 24 hours ago with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. The anger had burned out, leaving only a hollow void. He asked her one single question. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the entire garden. He asked her at what point during this entire elaborate, multi-layered financial plan she had ever intended to tell him the true story. Noel was completely trapped. The exits were sealed. The lies were exposed. And her new husband was looking at her like she was a stranger. Her carefully constructed facade completely evaporated. Instead of apologizing, instead of begging for forgiveness, she lashed out with the ugly, unvarnished truth. She blurted out that if I had not always been the chosen one, none of this would have ever been necessary. She screamed that grandmother Alma had unfairly handed me the keys to the kingdom, leaving her to constantly beg for scraps just to maintain a decent lifestyle. She yelled that I was a cold, unfeeling dictator holding the family hostage. It was an accidental, incredibly damning confession. She finally admitted out loud that her actions were not driven by desperate survival or simple misunderstandings. They were driven by a deep, toxic, and festering resentment that had rooted itself in her soul for decades. Hector and Dana realized the battle was entirely lost. Their wealthy, influential son-in-law was rapidly slipping through their fingers, and their golden child was publicly self-destructing. The sheer panic finally overtook their pride. My mother collapsed heavily into her chair, burying her face in her hands and openly weeping. The polished country club matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman. She begged me to sign the papers just one last time. She pleaded with me to save the family honor, wailing that if I refused to take on the debt, they would lose the house and end up sleeping on the street. My father completely abandoned his stoic posture. He leaned across the table, his hands shaking violently, pleading with me to protect them from the lenders. He promised he would pay me back every single penny, a hollow vow he had broken countless times before. They were begging the daughter they had banished to the catering tables just the night before to save their entire existence. Right at that exact moment, the heavy sound of thick tires crushing the gravel driveway broke through the sound of my mother weeping. Everyone turned their heads toward the wrought iron gates of the garden house. A large black sport utility vehicle bearing the discreet corporate logo of Blue Lark Capital rolled slowly onto the property, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Right behind the imposing vehicle was a plain silver sedan. The cars parked directly behind my sedan. The heavy doors opened. Two men in sharp, aggressive business suits stepped out of the black vehicle, their faces set in grim, unyielding expressions. A third man, wearing a cheap suit and carrying a thick, tightly banded stack of legal documents, stepped out of the silver car. It was a process server. The air in the orchard grew suddenly cold despite the rising sun. The lenders had not waited for Monday morning. They had realized the collateral was frozen, and they had come to collect. The final, devastating blow had just arrived at the front door. The three men walked up the stone pathway with heavy, deliberate steps, their presence casting a long, dark shadow over the ruined garden brunch. The process server stepped forward first, dropping a thick stack of manila envelopes onto the juice-stained mahogany table. They landed with a heavy thud right in front of my father. Mara Kincaid did not even wait for Hector to process the documents. She stood up, her posture radiating absolute authority, and addressed the representatives from Blue Lark Capital directly. She formally announced that an emergency judicial injunction had just been granted by a federal judge less than 1 hour ago. Every single document, deed transfer, and loan agreement bearing my forged electronic signature was now officially frozen and completely invalidated, pending a massive civil and potential criminal trial. She handed the lead representative a certified copy of the judge's order. The man from Blue Lark Capital barely glanced at my parents. He read the injunction, his face an unreadable mask of corporate ruthlessness. He looked at Hector and Dana, who were both practically hyperventilating in their chairs. He stated, in a voice devoid of any human empathy, that since there was now documented forensic evidence of a forged trustee signature, the firm was immediately executing the fraud clause in their contract. The millions of dollars in outstanding debt, along with the exorbitant late fees and the massive balloon payments, would not be attached to the Juniper Vale Trust. Instead, every single penny of that financial obligation was instantly reverted to the sole, personal liability of Hector and Dana. He informed them that because I had filed the objection within the legal time limit, the estate was entirely untouchable. They had absolutely nothing left to leverage. Their personal bank accounts, their leased luxury cars, and the very roof over their heads were now firmly in the crosshairs of a predatory equity firm that took no prisoners. The absolute finality of the statement hung in the air, a death sentence for their fabricated high society existence. Owen Talbot watched the entire exchange in total silence. He looked at the legal documents scattered across the table, then at my parents, and finally at Noel. My sister was trembling violently, her face pale and streaked with ruined makeup, staring at her new husband with wide, desperate eyes, silently begging him to save her. Owen stood up slowly. He reached for his left hand and seamlessly slid the heavy platinum wedding band off his finger. He placed it gently onto the center of the table, the small metallic clink echoing loudly in the quiet orchard. He looked directly at Noel. He did not raise his voice. He did not hurl insults. He simply stated that he would never participate in a marriage constructed entirely on a foundation of gross manipulation, systemic concealment, and calculated financial fraud. He told her, with absolute, freezing clarity, that he was immediately contacting his legal team to block the filing of their marriage certificate with the county clerk. Their union would never be legally finalized. He assured her that she would never possess a single legal tie to his name, his family trust, or his corporate credit profile. He severed the lifeline she had spent months desperately weaving, leaving her completely adrift in the wreckage of her own making. Owen then turned to Claire, nodded once, and the two of them walked away from the table. They walked down the stone path, got into their dark corporate vehicle, and drove away from the estate without ever looking back. The departure of the wealthy groom was the final devastating blow. Dana let out a piercing, agonizing scream. She lunged forward, slamming her fists onto the table, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated hatred. She shrieked that I was a monster. She yelled that I was maliciously destroying our family, tearing us apart piece by piece just to satisfy my own arrogant need for control. I stood up from my chair and looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me as nothing more than a convenient utility. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. "I am not destroying this family," I said, my voice cold, steady, and loud enough to resonate through the entire garden house. "I am simply the first person to stop funding its lies." Noel completely crumbled. She collapsed onto the stone floor of the terrace, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The reality of her situation finally crushed her. She had not just lost a wealthy husband and a lavish wedding. She had lost her entire meticulously planned script. The luxurious life she believed she had successfully stolen was gone forever, replaced by the terrifying certainty of federal investigations, massive personal debt, and public humiliation. I did not pull out my phone to record her breakdown. I did not start a live stream to gloat to her followers or seek validation from strangers on the internet. I did not offer any further insults or parting words of wisdom. True power does not require an audience or a dramatic monologue. I gathered my briefcase, nodded to Mara and Lila, and walked away from the garden house. I left the truth to stand entirely on its own, supported by forensic documents, sworn testimonies, and the crushing weight of impending legal consequences. The severance was absolute and final. In the months that followed, Hector and Dana declared total bankruptcy. They lost their country club memberships, their leased vehicles, and eventually, their primary residence, forced to downsize to a small, rented apartment in a different city entirely. Noel, facing potential charges for her role in the forgery and the wire fraud, fled the state to live with a distant relative. Her social media accounts permanently deleted, her aesthetic empire reduced to digital dust. I remained at the estate, but I refused to let the land remain a monument to their greed. I spent the next 2 years executing a massive, comprehensive restructuring of the Juniper Vale Trust. I poured the legitimate profits from the orchards and the guest cottages into a completely new vision. I transformed the sprawling property into Alma House. It became a highly secure, heavily funded private retreat and legal support center specifically designed for women who were actively escaping financial abuse and toxic family manipulation. We provided temporary housing in the renovated cottages, offered free forensic accounting services, and supplied top-tier legal representation to help victims untangle themselves from predatory financial traps set by their own relatives or spouses. The land that my family had tried to use as a weapon of manipulation was reborn as a fortress of absolute protection and genuine healing. On the opening night of Alma House, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of blooming apple blossoms. We hosted a private dinner for our first graduating cohort of women, our pro bono legal team, and our dedicated staff. The long mahogany table was set up on the very same terrace outside the garden house, but the suffocating tension of the past was completely gone, replaced by the warm, genuine laughter of survivors who had finally reclaimed their autonomy. The area was illuminated by the soft, amber glow of vintage lights strung beautifully through the ancient canopy. I walked onto the terrace, taking in the vibrant, joyful scene. I did not look for a place card hidden near the kitchen doors. I did not wait for someone to tell me where I was allowed to sit or ask me to move out of the camera frame. I walked directly to the exact center of the long table, pulled out the finest chair, and sat down surrounded by people who valued my mind, my strength, and my absolute refusal to break. I was no longer the forgotten sister pushed into the shadows. I was no longer a desperate signature hunted by liars. I was simply a woman who had finally, unequivocally, chosen her own seat at the table of her own life. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.